pozdravljeni vsi skupaj, veseli me, da se po dolgem času vidimo, zadnji 2 leti in toliko niste bili preveč naklonjeni takim srečanjem v živo in veseli me, da se je to zdaj spremenilo, upam, da bo trajalo in upam, da se še večkrat vidimo. Če bo vse po sreči, že do konca meseca lahko pričakujete, čez 14 dni približno, še eno predavanje, kolegica, ki tam v drugi vrsti sedi, Lucija Balikić, bo predavala o svojem raziskovanju odnosa britanskih in francoskih izobražencev in intelektualcev do nastanka Jugoslavije. Natančni termin moramo pa še uskladiti, pa ga moramo sporočiti. No, začnimo torej z današnjim predavanjem. Najprej bom predstavil našega predavatelja. Stefan Gužvica je trenutno doktorski študent na Univerzi pri Regensburgu, v Regensburgu, kjer pri Ulfu Brunnbauerju pripravlja dizertacijo. Današnje predavanje je del te dizertacije. Sicer je prej v letu 2018 magistriral na Central European University, njegovo magistrsko delo, ki se je ukvarjalo s Komunistično partijo Jugoslavije pred Titom, je bilo nagrajeno in je potem izšlo v angleščini, hrvaščini in tudi v slovenščini. Knjiga je izšla pri Založbi Sophia v slovenskem prevodu pred par leti in je seveda na voljo tako v knjižnicah kot tudi v knjigarnah. Današnje predavanje torej bo govorilo o balkanskem komunizmu in kominternski kontroli v prvih letih ali pa prvem desetletju in pol po prvi svetovni vojni oziroma po oktobrski revoluciji. Kot rečeno, to je del njegove doktorske dizertacije, skratka work in progress. Predavanje bo, to je tudi en del novih časov, v angleščini, ne recimo v skupnem jeziku, nekdanjem srbo-hrvaščini, ampak v diskusiji, za katero bo seveda na koncu dovolj časa, pa lahko zastavljate vprašanja tako v slovenščini, kot v angleščini, kot seveda tudi v katerikoli varianti srbo-hrvaščine. Stefan, izvoli.
Hvala. I will be talking today about this topic of Balkan communism and Comintern Control. I'll explain in a bit what I mean by Comintern Control, but I want to explain in a bit more detail what part of my dissertation this actually is. My dissertation is called Sickle Without a Hammer, Revolution and Nation Building in the Balkans, 1900s to the 1930s. So what I'm doing is I'm working on an intellectual history of Marxism and its relationship to the national question. But this final chapter of the dissertation is somewhat different because it's actually an institutional history. It's a history of a section of the Comintern which was known as the Balkan Communist Federation. And to kind of give it broader significance, I've decided to use it as a case study of this issue of Comintern control. So before I get into that, I will first explain a bit about the Balkan Communist Federation. Essentially, Balkan federalism has been a project of the left pretty much since the second half of the 19th century, unless you count also the earlier Enlightenment roots of the idea as part of broader left traditions. But Marxists in particular saw Balkan federalism as a way to use a cliche, to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, because on one hand it was seen as a project which would end nationalist conflict among different Balkan nations, and on the other hand it was seen as the only way for Balkan countries to have any kind of relevance and actual sovereignty in a region which is constantly contested by various great powers. First practical efforts at organizing of Marxist parties in the Balkans already happened during the social democracy of the Second International, and in January 1910 the first Balkan Social Democratic Conference took place in Belgrade, and the Balkan Communist Federation, which was established in Sofia in 1920, drew its roots from this pre-World War I Social Democratic Federation, and in fact most people who participated in Belgrade in 1910 would become communists and were also then among the founding members of the Balkan Communist Federation. Though in reality, the Balkan Communist Federation really came into being at its 3rd conference in July 1921, and it was kind of at the height of its power between 1923 and 25, 26. And later on, it slowly withered away until 1933, which is why 33 is tentatively the concluding year, although as you'll see, I'll be talking about events later on as well. Basically, the issue of the decrease in the importance of the Balkan Communist Federation is also related to the issue of the control of the Communist International over its constituent parties and the general abandonment of the horizon of the world revolution. But there were essentially two incarnations of the Balkan Communist Federation. I'm trying to present in parallel both a project of the Balkan Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, which was the ultimate goal of the Balkan Communists, and then you have the Balkan Communist Federation as an actually existing organization, which was an umbrella organization of Balkan parties within the Third International, and that was the 1920 establishment. The Balkan Communist Federation consisted of the communist parties of Romania, Greece, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia, and it also had the presence of Albanian communists, although Albania did not formally have a communist party until 1941. But the main importance of the Balkan Communist Federation, in spite of the fact that it was short-lived, and in spite of the fact that it was unsuccessful historically, as we know thus far, there has never been a single Balkan state established in the region. The main importance was this relationship between revolution and nation building, and that was fundamentally connected to the agrarian question, hence the choice of this 1929 painting by Krsto Hegedušić, where we see a requisition of the cattle of the peasants by the police officers. It illustrates neatly why the communists cared about the peasant question, but also what was its relationship to nation building, because the main purpose of the Balkan Communist Federation was to get heavily involved in the movements in the Balkans, which the communists considered to be national revolutionary. And the bottom line for the Balkan communists was that the national question in the Balkans in that particular period was fundamentally a peasant question, and therefore an issue of class struggle. So in their view, the manifestation of the class discontent of the peasantry was national ideology. So, you are, let's say, a Croatian peasant who's in debt in 1929, so the bank decides to take your cattle, it's the cops who are coming and taking it, right? And who are the cops in the Croatian countryside? Well, they're ethnic Serbs in the first Yugoslavia. And so at the level of immediate experience for the peasantry, they're seeing, these Serbian cops, maybe even Serbian banks, but certainly Serbian state authorities are taking away our livelihood, and therefore, in the view of the communists, this class dissatisfaction then manifests as a peasantist ideology. So this was the kind of overarching framework within which the Balkan Communist Federation operated, and I cannot stress this enough because there has been also a lot of misunderstandings about what the Comintern wanted to do with the national question, and I really want to emphasize that the national question was not pushed for the purposes of using one nationalism against another, or really using anyone's national goals, but rather for the purposes of channeling national ideology in a progressive direction and ultimately using it for the agenda of the communist revolution. Now, about the issue of Comintern Control, using the Balkan Communist Federation as a mid-level institution between the Communist International and its congresses and the Executive Committee as the highest ruling bodies, and the constituent parties, which were below the Balkan Federation. And I'm hoping to use this mid-level institution in order to get a better grasp of the dynamics between the Comintern and its constituent parties, because the central question in the studies of the Communist International is precisely the question of what people in the area call Comintern Control. In other words, the question is, how did an organization whose stated goal and purpose at the beginning was world revolution turn into an organization which is merely a tool of Soviet foreign policy by the 1930s? And this question is additionally complicated also by the uses of words, but also for the fact that it goes along two axes. You have the issue of the organizational model of communist parties and the question of intra-party democracy, but also the the question of complementarity with Soviet diplomatic interests. And some people kind of take for granted that both of these things are part of Comintern Control, or at least do not differentiate among them. And I think it's important to see that there are both of these things. One way that the control manifests itself is the gradual takeover of the Bolshevik organizational model, but then also later of the Stalinist organizational model by the constituent parties, which is coupled with a gradual dying out of intra-party democracy. But then a completely different phenomenon, though perhaps even more complex, is the phenomenon of, at what point are you actually pushing for a revolutionary strategy, and at what point are you actually just defending the diplomatic interest of a state, which, is a worker state, but you're still trying to be internationalist and not to defend particular national interests. And this is a bit difficult to untangle, but I hope I'll do a good job at it. I just want to mention then that, there are these terms which are used in historiography. Most common ones are Bolshevization and Stalinization, to refer to the processes of Bolshevization as the increased Comintern control over its parties, or as it was defined by the Fifth Comintern Congress as the application of Leninism to concrete national conditions, which I think was very euphemistic already, and then Stalinization as the moment where the Stalin era leadership takes over the Comintern and uses it for its own purposes. Of course, the very term also implies kind of a discontinuity between Bolshevism and Stalinism, which is very interesting, and not everybody agrees about this, although I certainly do. And I'm using the terms slightly differently from how they've been used in historiography so far. So I'm using these three stages basically. First one being Grassroots Bolshevization, which, even though the Comintern is founded in 1919, I think it's a process we can see in 1917 already, perhaps during the First World War, and it's the path towards a revolutionary international, and framed by the overall revolutionary context of those 6 years. So I use the term Bolshevization as a moment of acceptance of Bolshevism by various parties, and I'll explain that in greater details. It's particularly interesting because my definition of Bolshevization predates the introduction of the term Bolshevization by the Comintern, which took place in 1924. In my view, at that point, the parties were already more or less Bolshevized. The second stage then is Russification, and I use this term because this is the moment where we see first serious complementarities between Comintern policy and Soviet diplomatic interests. Although what we still see in this period, and I would argue we see this still around the end of Stalinization, is that there is still a dialectic of revolution and Soviet national interests, so to say. The Soviet Union is not a nation state, obviously, but it has its own geopolitical interests. And all the way until 1931, I think we see concentrated attempts at finding a balance between the two. Stalinization then coincides with the new opposition to Stalin by Zinoviev and Kamenev, which then, of course, gets into a collaboration with Trotsky, and which is very important because Zinoviev is the head of the Communist International. So this is really the moment when the Stalin leadership is afraid of the factional struggles spilling over into the Comintern and losing the ground there, actually, as opposed to the Soviet Party, which is why I think they go on this offensive from 1926. And I think this process is pretty much complete around 1931. I'll also explain a bit why, and that from 31 until its demise, and there are two demises, one being the Great Purge, where most of the Comintern staff and revolutionaries are murdered, and the other one being obviously 1943, when the Comintern is formally abolished. But this is, both of these I think can kind of be considered the end of the Comintern in various ways. So I will look at the particular stages one by one and explain to you what I mean by this and how this took place. But the most important thing about grassroots Bolshevization is really this grassroots aspect, and I use it because of the context of the World Revolution. Because of the fact that once Lenin takes power, you see, he's cleaning the earth. He's not just cleaning Russia, right? The idea was to have a revolutionary wave from Aachen to Vladivostok, and that does happen. It's just that the revolutions get defeated in Germany, in Italy, in Hungary, but there is a revolutionary wave which Lenin was hoping, he would kind of push by first taking power in Russia. So what I think is important for this first stage is that we are seeing not an articulation of the Bolshevik doctrine within Russia, but a global articulation of the communist doctrine. For lack of a better term, I call it Bolshevization, and also Bolshevism kind of becomes synonymous with communism because it is the only successful revolution in this period. But even though I call it Bolshevization, it's supposed to imply this global revolutionary experience, and the fact that experiences in Germany, in Italy, and in Hungary are shaping the international communist movement almost as much as the experience of Soviet Russia at that point. And this also has roots in 1914 in the split between the internationalist social democrats and those that they derogatively called social patriots, the social democrats who supported the World War. And therefore there was a very strong push against what they saw as reform socialism, and this has its roots already in the Zimmerwald left of the First World War and Lenin's already early attempts to form an international. And this context is very important because the second Congress of the Comintern in 1920, which is the de facto founding Congress, it's when they managed to get more people than just those who were in Russia at the time, it passed the infamous 21 conditions for admission in the Communist International. And 21 conditions are infamous because they were a set of demands that every communist party had to fulfill in order to become a member of the International. And it has been subsequently criticized as the moment where Soviet control over constituent parties begins. And I think this is not exactly the case because the idea of the 21 conditions is that it's a safeguard against reformism. It's the idea that the Second International had all of these very nice proclamations about internationalism, but it did not have any institutions that would ensure that these decisions are put into action. And this became evident in 1914. So the idea of the 21 conditions was to try and preempt the kind of disasters that happened in 1914 and the whole period of the First World War in the eyes of the Marxists. And it also, I think it's important to mention that although the conditions were drafted by Lenin, they weren't 21 at the beginning. They were added by foreign communists, most notably Amadeo Bordiga of the Italian Communist Party. So this, I think, also shows both the internationalist aspect of the early Comintern, but also the fact that we cannot really read these histories backwards. We cannot read the 21 conditions from the perspective of what happened later on. And this also rings true for other moments in the history of this institution. And obviously the point of the 21 conditions was also to foster splits. The idea was that the communist parties have to completely rid themselves of the reformists so that the situations of 1914 or 1918, 1919 in Germany would not repeat and so on. But still, what we have essentially, I think, is an organization, an international organization coming together and putting a set of demands for joining that organization, which I think is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. And we had a similar thing in the Balkan Communist Federation. Starting from Sophia in 1920, we see a culture of meetings and deliberations. In the Cold War, Joseph Rothschild, the historian of the Bulgarian Communist Party, claimed that all of these meetings were dominated by Moscow representatives, that people would come from Moscow in the name of the Comintern in 1920 and 1921 to Vienna, to Sofia, where the Balkan communists would meeting, and they would be the ones setting the tone of the discussions. But it is absolutely not like that. The discussions are very much framed, we know now from primary sources from Moscow, they're very much framed by the local conditions and by the revolutionary concerns of the communists in the Balkans. And of course, what I think is very important is that we very much see a freedom of discussion. Yes, there are boundaries, there is no freedom of discussion within an organization for reformists, some of whom are expelled although they also go back and forth on that as well, starting from 1922, trying to keep some, the Balkan Communist Federation actually against the Greek Communist Party tries to keep reform socialists within the Greek party, and the reasoning behind that is the new policy of the United Front in 1922, which was a defensive policy at a time when they felt that the revolutionary wave is coming to an end and that they will have to once again turn to some sort of cooperation on the left. Then around 22-23, we have the beginnings of Russification. And there are two very interesting moments there. They're basically anecdotes, but I thought it's worth starting with them because they kind of show the concerns. And they show these two layers that I was talking about, because Lenin talks about organizational problems and Milutin talks about geopolitical problems. Explain who Milutin is in a bit. So in 1922, at the 4th Congress, Lenin gives a speech. His health was already very frail. And it was the last speech he gave before the international communist movement, and it was a speech he gave criticizing the theses, the organizational theses of the 3rd Congress of the Communist International, and he criticized them in his own words for being too Russian, meaning that he thought that the Russian organizational model of illegal factory cells was coming in contradiction with other forms of organizing that could have been better suited for Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and so on. And although this was kind of like Lenin's last message to the Congress, it was never really reflected on by the Comintern subsequently. And the main point of the Bolshevization process would be to replace the old local organization, which was the tradition of European communist parties brought over from social democracy. You know, you would have like a region in a city, and the party cell would be organized around that. It was being moved to factories, as was being done in the Soviet Union. And this was or rather pre-revolutionary Russia. And this was something that encountered a lot of resistance, and it just based on practical successes of the communist parties in Europe in the 20s, it doesn't really seem to have worked. So this was Lenin's last message to the Comintern. And then we have roughly at the same time an extremely interesting memorandum by Vladimir Milutin. And Milutin was the first People's Commissar for Agriculture after the Bolsheviks took power. You see him there. He was, of course, also later murdered by Stalin. And Milutin was sent by the Bolsheviks to Vienna to head the Southern Bureau of the Comintern, which also worked closely with the Balkan Communist Federation. And I don't think it was an accident that they sent the guy who's in charge of agriculture to Vienna to be in charge of Balkan affairs, because they're still already very much talking about this idea of the national question as a peasant question. And the memorandum is fascinating because he basically attended the 4th Congress of the Bulgarian Communist Party and the 4th Balkan Communist Conference. And the situation in Bulgaria was such that Bulgaria had an agrarian government in power. The peasant party of Stalinism was ruling, and the new United Front policy, which was based on collaboration with social democracy in Western Europe, was based on collaboration with agrarian parties in Eastern Europe. And the very presence of this new type of regime, Stalinism really saw himself also as a revolutionary of sorts and claimed that him and Lenin are the only true revolutionaries in Europe of the time. It created a very volatile situation, and it seemed that, you know, if he doesn't hold, and he probably won't, there would either be a far-right government of Bulgaria or a communist revolution. And everybody in the Balkans was expecting that if a revolution starts, it starts in Bulgaria. And then what Milutin says is that the Bulgarian communists said, we have a really huge problem if a revolution starts in Bulgaria, because it's 1922, the civil war is barely ending in the Soviet Union, all the other revolutions have been defeated, and then if a revolution happens in Bulgaria, obviously they will have the same problems as the Bolsheviks had in 1917. Everybody around them will declare war on them. So if you have a revolution in Bulgaria, you can easily expect an invasion from Greece, from Yugoslavia, from Romania. From Yugoslavia and Romania, you can also expect Poland and Czechoslovakia to be drawn in. And already Poland being again at war with the USSR is a disaster. And of course, that could also result in France being drawn in, which is what they really feared. And this is something that the Bulgarian communists are aware of, and something that Milutin, all that he can say is, yes, you are correct. Either we can betray our internationalist principles in case of a revolution, and say, well, we don't care about Bulgaria, we actually don't support this at all, or you can say that, in fact, we support it, send arms, get into war, and then risk that the Soviet Union also gets fully defeated because it's in no position to have a war. And this is the constant tension that would be present. And the reasoning of the United Front was to broaden the communist base of support by working with agrarian and agrarian and national parties. And again, bringing in the idea of the national question as a peasant question. You could have revolts of the peasantry in the Balkans, of the Croatian peasantry, of the peasantry in Bessarabia and Macedonia against all three states that had partitioned Macedonia. And then perhaps you can talk about tearing down the order that was established in Versailles and the Balkan-wide revolution, which would make a situation far better for international communism than if there was just a revolution of workers in Bulgaria. And the Bulgarian communists, a lot of Balkan communists, but this is really the fault of Bulgarians and their leader at the time, Hristo Kabakčiev, they're kind of nodding their heads all the time and saying, yes, 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 this makes a lot of sense. And then in June 1923, there's a far-right coup against Stamboliski, and they do nothing. They just remain passive, and they say, this is, two factions of the bourgeoisie fighting each other, we don't care. And this is seen as a great error by pretty much anyone who had a more sophisticated understanding of Bolshevism at the time. The Romanian member of the Balkan Communist Federation was absolutely outraged. The Comintern was outraged. There was an extended plenum of the executive taking place at the time. Zinoviev came and said, we can only hope that these that this is fake news, that we can't believe that they stayed passive, because what they were supposed to do is not simply defend Stamboliski's government, but use that situation for a revolutionary counteroffensive. And they didn't do that. And also they did not in any way involve not only the peasantry, but also the national organizations. So you have the internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, VMRO, and VMRO sides with the far-right coup. And this is a major defeat for the labor movement, even without the perspective of Bolshevism, because from the 1890s, there are Marxists in VMRO. The person who starts the Ilinden uprising in 1903 is both a member of the Bulgarian Narrow Socialists and VMRO, but this collaboration does not continue after the First World War. And this is when this is kind of when the Bolsheviks get into panic mode, and the Comintern in general, because the whole Zinoviev Comintern was hoping, we will kind of push for an uprising and then things will kind of spontaneously go on their own. It's called the theory of the offensive. And the Soviets push, first of all, Soviet diplomacy takes over what is supposed to be the job of the Balkan Communist Federation and Bulgarian Communist Party. Instead of waiting for the Bulgarian communists to collaborate with the agrarians in VMRO, it's the Soviet intelligence and diplomatic services in Vienna that take the first steps. At the same time, we see a first moment of really clear Comintern pressure. There's an uprising of communists in September 1923 in Bulgaria. It's a complete disaster, and it was something that the Bulgarians knew would be a disaster, but it was something that the Comintern imposed on them. And this is one of these first important moments of imposition. And the perception of Bulgaria is also important there, because it was generally accepted by Marxists at the time that the best communists outside of the Soviet Union are in the Bulgarian Communist Party. And it was a great disappointment to see the Bulgarian Communist Party act like that. And then at roughly the same time, the fall of 1923 and especially 1924, Trotsky is already getting into first conflicts with the troika of Stalin, Kamenev, and Zinoviev, which is beginning to take over power as Lenin is on his deathbed. And it's interesting also that it is at this point, for the first time, in December 1923, that we see a member of the Bolshevik Party, Milutin specifically, describing the situation within the Communist Party of Yugoslavia as factionalism. Previously, they're talking about, conflicting groups and so on, but factionalism is very important in the context of 1923, because in 1921, the Bolshevik Party internally banned factions. The idea was that this was a temporary policy during the retreat that was taking place at the time, again related to the failure of the World Revolution, but the ban on factions was never lifted. It would be used as an assault on Trotsky and all the other oppositionists, because in reality a ban on factions meant subjecting the entire membership of the party to the Central Committee and then to the Politburo, which also kind of spontaneously and not in a planned way became the ruling organ of the party. But still, for the time, factionalism is seen as something that is unhealthy but legitimate. And at the 5th Congress, we have the beginnings of Bolshevization. I mentioned already the quote, the application of the general principles of Leninism to the concrete situation of the given country. What I think is that by 1924, this had already taken place. So when they started talking about Bolshevization in 1924, what they truly meant was not making these parties properly communist, because most of them already were, but rather imposing the Russian organizational and political model onto these parties. And again, trying to look at it in the context of the time, it did make sense. You are really disappointed by what happened in Bulgaria, and in general, you're beginning thinking that, yeah, these parties aren't Bolshevik enough. How else do you explain the fact that there was no successful revolution anywhere else other than in backwards Russia? So the very fact that the Bolshevik Revolution succeeded kind of built up on this legitimacy. And there are two other major precedents. The first one is obviously the June coup, and of course not just the June coup, but the subsequent intervention of the Soviets in the affairs of the constituent parties of the Comintern. But the two big precedents are actually the appointment of Đuro Cvić as the secretary of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, and the sacking of Gheorghe Cristescu, who was expelled from the Communist Party of Romania in 1926. These two men had very little in common, except for the fact that in both of these cases the decision had been reached by the Executive Committee of the Communist International. So the decision to make Cvić the leader of the party was not reached by his own party, and the decision to expel Gheorghe Cristescu was not reached by his own party. Even more importantly, from the beginnings of the Comintern, the supreme executive body of the Comintern was its Congress, not its executive committee. But starting really from 1922, more and more power is vested into the executive committee, first into its plenums and then later just meetings of the executive, which is groups of about a dozen people behind closed doors, sometimes more but never more than 30. So it's at this point that we really have very clear first signs of direct involvement. It's also important that these are not necessarily met with disdain on behalf of the communists. I mean, certainly Cristescu wasn't happy that he was expelled, right? But Cvić was very happy that he was appointed. And people who were, getting these appointments, they kind of felt vindicated because the Comintern was mediating in their factional struggles. And the struggles concerned, I won't get into too much details on that, but they concerned the question of the application of the United Front and the relationship towards peasantry and national parties. And somebody like Cvić, he claims that his opponents in the party don't understand the United Front and the relationship to the peasantry. And then when the Comintern makes him the party leader, that is a confirmation that he is correct, actually. And likewise for opponents of Cristescu when he was expelled. But it's interesting that in spite of this, the Comintern and the Balkan Federation both still expect cooperation. All the main policy documents pertaining to the United Front in the Balkans are still reached at the Balkan Communist conferences, not even at the Comintern congresses. So they have a relative autonomy, a clear autonomy there. There's only like general guidelines that are reached at congresses, but even those are something that they participate in articulating. And the Balkan Federation and the Comintern expect cooperation. Yes, there are conflicting currents, but when Cvić comes to power, they keep saying to him, the fact that you're a party leader doesn't mean you now expelled these opponents of yours. You actually work together with them, because the point of democratic centralism as the guiding principle of the party is that we are all working together towards the same goal. But that doesn't work like that in practice, and actually very often it is the rank and file of the parties that is pushing for expulsions rather than the Comintern. And in that sense, Cristescu is more of an exception because his policy really was just social democratic. So in that sense, his expulsion kind of makes sense. And then what we have in 1926 is the beginnings of Stalinization. I think 25, 26 also depends how you look at it, but the main thing there is that we have, in 1925, Bukharin and Stalin coming forth with the policy of socialism in one country. This leads to the breakup of the alliance of Stalin with Kamenev and Zinoviev, who joined the opposition, but also it results in the first very clear political turn of the Communist International in line with the foreign policy goals of the Soviet Union. So 1925-26 is a period of what I call the right turn in the Comintern. It's not my term, but the right turn was already noted by Trotsky in his history of the Communist International. It was noted by a couple of researchers, but it has not really received, I think, as much attention as it needs, because the turn of 1925, even though it still called itself the United Front, was, I think, as drastic as the turn of 1928, which I'll talk about shortly. Basically, with the policy of socialism in one country, and the Soviet Union kind of tries to establish itself in the international order. There's the establishment of the Anglo-Russian Trade Union Committee with the British trade unions, which are reformist, and this is something that is very much contested by the opposition. In the Balkans, this is coupled with attempts of the Soviet Union to establish diplomatic relations with countries such as Romania, which again is guided by the idea to just, secure the border that Romania and the Soviet Union share, to not have a constant fear of getting invaded. But then if you're the Communist Party of Romania, the Soviets can't pretend that the Comintern and the Soviet Union are separate. So the Communist Party of Romania can't talk anymore about the secession of Bessarabia and Transylvania if the Bolsheviks are trying to normalize relations with Romania. So what we see from 1926 to 1928 is that the Balkan Communist Federation plays down the policy of self-determination until secession, which until then was, in their view, the main way to attract the national and peasant organizations. You attract the VMRO by saying you will get self-determination for Macedonia. You attract Stjepan Radić by saying you'll get self-determination for Croatia, and so on. But also an important change is that an extended plenum in early 1926 creates a permanent delegation of the Russian Communist Party within the Third International. So this is a moment when a permanent delegation is becoming, first an advisory body and then, more or less the ruling body of the Comintern. Although never in practice, but it was always up to them what would be done. At the same time, slightly earlier in 1925, the Balkan Communist Federation, its headquarters are moved from Vienna to Moscow, and in 1926 it is de facto replaced with the Balkan Land Secretariat of the Comintern. And the Balkan Communist Federation continues to exist until 1933, but this moment is kind of the moment of its end, because the Balkan Land Secretariat becomes the new umbrella organization of the Balkan Communist parties. And the relationship between the Balkan Communist Federation and the Balkan Land Secretariat is never clearly defined by any official document, and what we have is simply the Balkan Land Secretariat gradually taking over the jurisdictions of the Balkan Communist Federation, and Georgi Dimitrov, most of all, fighting in vain to kind of preserve this. And then the situation, of course, also really escalates because of Zinoviev in the Comintern. All of this, I think, is done in preparation to get rid of Zinoviev, which, of course, Stalin eventually succeeds in. But you have a problem because Zinoviev does have a very strong support base in the Comintern. A Yugoslav communist, actually, Vojislav Vujović, is the head of the Young Communist International and one of Zinoviev's closest allies. He's actually used to bring Zinoviev down, but that's a story for some other time. But what happens is that there's also a moment where the leadership of the Greek Communist Party actually openly sides with Trotsky, and they all get expelled. So And again, precisely about the application of the policy of self-determination until secession, the leadership says that this policy had been misguided in the previous period. And as I said, the Comintern also abandoned this policy. But we see here, this almost, I hate the term, but almost Orwellian way of looking at it, because you're allowed to say self-determination made sense in 1924, but it doesn't make sense in 1926 because the material conditions changed. What you're not allowed to say is what the Greeks said, which is that self-determination doesn't make sense now in 1926, and it didn't make sense in 24 either. The Comintern was wrong. And this is basically why they're all purged from the party. And then in 1928, you have the 6th Comintern Congress, and I think this is the Comintern's 1921 moment, because this deterioration of relations in the Bolshevik Party and among all of these parties leads to a concerted attack on factionalism. So from 1928, that's why I say the 1921 moment, from 1928 being a factionalist is in the Comintern as much of a political crime as it is in the Bolshevik Party starting from 1921. So from 1928, we have a situation where anybody who had been previously associated with the factions, known usually as the left and the right faction, is no longer allowed to be in the leadership of the parties. Only those who had the reputations of so-called anti-factionalists managed to rise to the top. And this then becomes increasingly severe over the years. Some of them are already expelled in 28, 29, others are expelled during the Purge in 1932, and in general you have an intensification of distrust towards factionalists, which then culminates in the Purge, where most of the factionalists from the 1920s are murdered. But the other context is that if you still read most of the historiographies, Romanian party is actually, I think, a noble exception, but if you read the Yugoslav party histories in particular, the idea is that there's this constant factionalism. In 1928, the Zagreb Party Conference, led by Tito and Hebrang, denounces factions, the Comintern meets in Moscow, publishes an open letter, and that's the end of factions. This is completely wrong. And you can get that it's wrong from reading it, because the way the story goes is 1929, Đuro Đaković is murdered by the Yugoslav police. Then Jovan Mališić becomes party secretary, then Anton Mavrak, then Filip Filipović, and it just, guys keep changing between 1929 and 1931-32, but no one in historiography exactly explains to you why this is happening. And the reason why this is happening is because factionalism still exists, and now it is more directly mediated by the Comintern, and you can say policed by the Comintern, because the factionalists are, they're using kind of more Aesopian language to explain their disagreements, but briefly, the disagreements are very much there, and they're more volatile because now it is effectively a crime to be a factionalist. And the disagreements are related to the fall of Bukharin, because Bukharin is the person who articulates Comintern policy in 1928, but by 1929 he's already fallen out of favor with Stalin because of collectivization, which means, again, you have to get rid of disloyal people in the Comintern, now people who are supported by Bukharin. And Stalin has an extremely interesting maneuver there. I'll try to keep it very brief. But basically, the interpretation was that the Russian Revolution was, it had a bourgeois stage in February 1917, and then the proletarian stage in October. Stalin and Bukharin had the view that underdeveloped countries, meaning also the Balkans, but also China, which is where this policy failed, would have the same stage, and that was the basis for cooperation with the Comintern in China. But Trotsky said that no, because of the increasing rule of financial capital, these countries would immediately have socialist revolutions. So you have this two-stage view of Bukharin and Stalin and one-stage view of Trotsky. In 1928, the Comintern embraces the one-stage view of Trotsky as a maneuver against Bukharin. And the next 3 years, all of these debates that are taking place between Bukharinists and Trotskyists. They're not called like that, although sometimes they accuse each other of that because, again, formally factions don't exist, but this is what is happening. And then it ends in 1931-32 with the complete marginalization of both Bukharinists and Trotskyists, and the establishment of what I call the little Stalins. So, the new organizational model was very much based on this principle of one single dominant leader. You would have Georgi Dimitrov in the Bulgarian Communist Party, although he would come somewhat later in 34 because of the dynamics of that party that I won't get into. Nikos Zachariadis, who becomes the head of the Communist Party in 1931 in Greece and pretty much stays until Khrushchev. And Milan Gorkic, who was set to be Yugoslavia's little Stalin, but who was killed in the Great Purge, obviously to be replaced eventually by Tito. All three of them are on the Bukharinist position that there would be in underdeveloped countries a bourgeois democratic stage followed by the socialist stage. And this, I think, Stalin sees as more flexible because later it enables more openness to collaboration with non-communist forces. And these are the people of the Popular Front in 1935. And finally, what happens at this time is the utter marginalization of the Balkan Communist Federation. So the Balkan Federation pretty much dies down. It has its last conference in Moscow after the 6th Comintern Congress. Dimitrov tries to revive it, but Dimitrov is has already fallen out of favor in the Balkans and in the Bulgarian party. The new head of the Balkan Land Secretariat is Bela Kun, who doesn't like Dimitrov at all. They don't like each other. And he's sent to Berlin, the Balkan Communist Federation. The only wish that he's granted is that it's somewhere in Europe closer to events, but he's sent to Berlin as a form of administrative exile. He runs there the Western European Bureau of the Comintern and the Balkan Communist Federation until his arrest by the Nazis. And that's kind of the end of the Balkan Communist Federation, which is then also politically abandoned. And I hate long quotes, but I will not bother you with reading it, but I think you can read it yourselves. Basically, this is from an article of John McIlroy and Alan Campbell from about 3 years ago, which deals with the issue of Comintern Control, and I think it gives a very good outline of what Stalinism is, as opposed to how things were done in the 1920s, including authoritarian planning and this, single leader, social mobility, but social mobility replacing the kind of revolutionary elites of the 1920s and so on. And I think the Comintern, from the moment, it depends on the party, it's 1931 or 1932, when all the Trotskyist and Bukharinist factions are removed. You have the single Stalinized leadership and the Stalinized Comintern. What we see is that the changes basically take place in Moscow. Later on, I wrote about this in my book on Tito. Tito is confirmed as the party leader by the Fifth Land Conference in 1940, and this is seen as a source of legitimacy because he was confirmed as a leader in Yugoslavia. But the fact is that if he hadn't gotten the mandate from the Comintern, the outcome of the vote of the Yugoslav Communist Party would have been irrelevant at that point. And it's the same. It's the same with all the other. Parties. The idea of the Balkan Communist Federation is completely abandoned. The institution has already been destroyed by the victory of Nazism, but also the victory of Nazism pushes for the Popular Front policy, which is, now we see complete complementarity of Soviet foreign policy interests in the Comintern. They completely abandoned the revolutionary horizon for the sake of establishing coalition governments that involve communists in places such as France and Spain. The ultimate goal of the Soviet Union at the time being, of course, to create an anti-fascist alliance between France and Britain and Soviet Union on one side to confront Nazi Germany. But even these policy shifts, they take way slower than they used to. The Comintern was very dynamic in the 1920s. If anything was slowing down the Comintern, it was simply the post-war chaos that people couldn't travel from A to B easily and organize conferences, but they would change policies in line with the changing political situation. What happens here is that Hitler comes to power in 1933, and they don't adopt the Popular Front policy until the summer of 1935. And I think the reason for that is also this specter of factionalism, because how do you say we need a policy shift now without being called a factionalist and expelled? And that's what they have to do it very cautiously. It's done by Gorkic in the Yugoslav party, by Dimitrov. The French also actually push for this, but it takes a very long time, as you see, and that kind of slowness, I think, then follows the socialist systems in the 20th century in a lot of ways till the end, because you're always afraid that your constructive criticism might be interpreted as treason in the worst case scenario. And then, of course, we have, that's directly related to this, that factionalism fosters distrust. And you have, the International Control Commission of the Comintern is only established in 1928, if I remember correctly, at the 6th Congress. And, basically the policing of members of the constituent parties really takes off there, and the purge apparatus becomes bigger and bigger. And more, the idea is that factionalism is not just a matter of political disagreement, but perhaps hidden treason. So ultimately, I think that this idea of factionalism thus dissolves into what would become the Great Purge, which is, not only the Bolshevik Party kind of committing suicide, but all the constituent parties whose leaderships were in Moscow as well. And to conclude, why do I think it worked? Why did so few people say that, hey, this is not exactly what we had in mind, what Lenin had in mind? And I think two main reasons are, one is class loyalty. It's something I can't stress enough, also because with the national question, again, the policy of the Balkan parties has been seen in a national key. But it's not that, it's class loyalty that is a determining factor for them, and they see the Soviet Union as the embodiment of the worker-peasant government. And therefore, it's what do you do outside of supporting the Soviet Union as the first successful worker state? So in that sense, you have a lot to lose, especially when you've dedicated your whole life to it, when you've been in prison, when you've been beaten, when your friends and comrades and lovers have been killed. So there's this very strong, I guess, not only loyalty, but an emotional attachment that has to be taken into account. And then that's, of course, coupled with the prestige of Bolshevism. And you have to keep in mind also later the arguments in the Stalin era are kind of even mechanical, but if communism is already predestined to be the future of mankind, Eric Hobsbawm put it beautifully. He said, we believe that our victories are already written in the history books of the future. If you believe in that, how else do you explain the fact that it only worked in the Soviet Union, if not that there's something that the Bolsheviks know that the rest of us don't, right? So that also strengthens them. And then, of course, there's the issue of, this is how it started in the Cold War, the issue of Comintern Control. Is there something inherently totalitarian about the way this was set up during Lenin? And I think I've argued why I think this is not the case. But it is fascinating to see how many people, nevertheless, who were there in 1917, 1918, did not necessarily see the contradiction between what they were doing then and something that is very different, that is as different from revolutionary socialism as the Popular Front in France. And ultimately, I think that this was in that moment a story of the failure of democratic centralism as the guiding principle of the Bolshevik Party in that moment, because this worked incredibly well and made the Bolshevik Party very flexible once it was an illegal underground party. The idea that you can argue as much as you want. Once we've reached a collective decision, we go and put it into action. But this idea, of course, presumed the democratic aspect, presumed criticism, self-criticism, and very fierce debates that were a constant feature of the Bolshevik movement. But what happens with the condemnation of factionalism is a move of democratic centralism from cooperation to competition. That rather than having, harsh but comradely debates, you have kind of fierce, ruthless struggles for power, and ultimately, even by the time of the Great Purge, the attempts to physically eliminate your political opponents, for a lot of people, tragically, because you genuinely believe that the fact that they disagree with you politically means that they are actual traitors. So, thank you very much.
Stefan, še enkrat najlepša hvala za tole. Jaz mislim, da smo se vsi veliko naučili, da smo dobili nekaj stvari, o katerih bomo lahko še razmišljali, idej in tako naprej. Hvala lepa. Zahvaliti se moramo seveda tudi Erasmusu, ki nam je omogočil Stefanovo gostovanje tukaj v Ljubljani v zadnjih mesecih, in seveda vsi napeto čakamo na rezultate, ki bodo potem v naslednjih letih objavljeni. Glede na dosedanjo zgodovino lahko pričakujemo, da bo to objavljeno v več jezikih. zagotovo vsaj v enem. Toliko bilo za danes to vse. Še enkrat hvala. Hvala vsem, ki ste prišli. Upam, da se vidimo še v prihodnje.